In this video, I'm going to show you how to create a sample of rouleau loops with lacing. Your sample is going to consist of some ribbon applied at the end to lace up your loops, and you'll have two opposite samples of rouleau loops. You're going to need at least 3 loops on each side to be able to lace them up. Examples of rouleau loops can be found on the back of things like wedding dresses or corsets, where you have a series of loops down each side of the back. So you can see these ones here down this side and the ones down this side here, and then those are laced up to form the fastening at the back. You could have a rouleau loop used as a button loop, as a fastening at the front of a garment or at the back of a garment, as in this example here, where there's just a single loop for the front. To create your sample, you're going to need to cut 4 pieces of fabric that are 8 centimetres wide by 12 centimetres long. These will be used to attach your rouleau loops to. These will also be interfaced if you've used a lightweight fabric. You'll then need to cut your bias strips, and these strips will be about 30 centimetres in length and 3 centimetres wide, and for this I've used a lightweight slippery fabric which is much easier to turn to the right side once the strips are sewn. To cut your strips, you may also find it useful to have a pattern master ruler or some sort of other long ruler such as this grader ruler, and you'll need some scissors, something to mark your lines with, so such as chalk or a erasable pen. And then for turning your strips, you'll need a loop turner or a needle. You need to cut yourself 2 strips that are about 30 centimetres in length and 3 centimetres wide. And you need to cut those strips across the bias of your fabric. So if you've got your straight grain, then you want to be cutting diagonally to that. So if you have a pattern master, and you can see that that's the straight grain, and then that would be the diagonal of the 45-degree angle across from that. So I can use the lines on the ruler. If I put this line that's the 45-degree angle onto the raw edge of my fabric and then draw a line from there, this line would be at a 45-degree angle to the straight grain, so I'm cutting on the bias. And I want to cut these strips about 3 centimetres wide, so I can use the markings on here, the 3 centimetre line, so I can easily draw and cut my strips. I'm only doing a small sample, so if I was doing something quite large, I would need to cut considerably more strips. Once you've marked them, then you can just cut these off. Don't worry too much if your cutting is not absolutely perfect, because we're not actually going to use the raw edge to measure the sewing line from. But it does help if they are pretty much accurate. Now that I've cut my strips, what I need to do is to stitch them and then turn them right side out. So I'm going to be folding these right sides together. So if you can try and identify which is the right side, it might be the shinier side of your fabric. And then fold these right sides so that they're facing. And if you want, you can then pin these, or you could just not bother pinning and just stitch them. I'm going to put a couple of pins in just to get me started, and then I'm ready to go over to the machine and stitch these. what I would need to do is to measure 6mm from the folded edge. So that's why it's not so important to make sure your strips are absolutely perfect in being 3cm wide, because I'm actually going to measure from the folded edge rather than the raw edge. So this is a bit unusual. So I know that on my foot there's like this inside ridge here that's 6mm in from the needle. So you might have a 1/4 inch foot, which is 6mm, and then you could use the edge of that foot as a guide. I've also put some masking tape here, so that could be another option. I'm going to sew these in black so you can see where I'm stitching, but it would be advisable to use a colour that matches your fabric, because you would be able to see the stitch line through the fabric once these are turned. So just do some back tacking to begin with, and then try not to stretch the strips as you sew them. But what I will do is to take the pins out, because I find that although some of the time I can just sew over your pins, in this case, because the fabric's quite thin, it can mean that the line of stitch goes off a little bit. So just keep your eye on the line that you need to follow rather than on the needle, and that will help you to keep the stitching straight. Back tack when you get to the end. And then just cut the threads. So you can see that I've sewn 6mm from the folded edge. And what you want to make sure is that you've got pretty much an even stitch all the way down, and that the distance is the same all the way down from the folded edge. It's not the end of the world if it isn't, because you can always just pick out and cut off the sections of your strip that are even. So I'm going to just do that again with my second strip, and then I'm going to show you a couple of ways to turn the strip to get them right side out. Now I've sewn my strips, I now need to turn them right side out. So this is the bit that people quite often find really tricky. So I've got a couple of techniques that I would use to do this. There's plenty of other suggestions out there on how you can do this, but these are my sort of 2 ways in which I find work best. So what some people choose to do is to cut off the seam allowance, but I like to keep the seam allowance because that means that the tube, once it's turned, is going to have like a filling in it. So this kind of, the seam allowance acts really as your stuffing for your tube. If you're finding it difficult to turn the strip, then you might find that you want to cut some of that seam allowance off. That might help you, but I would advise just leaving it on. So there's a couple of methods you can use. I've got a loop turner, which is this thing here. Now if you don't have one of those, you could just use a needle. Any old needle's fine. Blunt ones are easier, but you can just use a regular needle. So I'll show you both methods. So I take my loop turner and my strip, and I'm going to poke my loop turner from one end all the way through to the other end. And then this has got like a latch on the top here. So you can see there's like a hook at the top there, and what I want to do is try to hook that into the fabric. So I'm going to stab that into the fabric at the top there, and then I'm going to pull that through, and I want to just make sure it's beginning to turn at the top there, and then once it starts to turn, sort of hold this taut so it doesn't unhook itself, and just start to pull that back through, pulling that through there. So then I can unhook this, just pull the end out a little bit more at the that tip there, and then finish turning the rest of that tube. So as you'll see, you can see the black thread a little bit through this, which is why you want to make sure you've sewn in white or something to match your fabric. So that's one way, is to use the loop turner. The other way, if you don't have the loop turner, is just to use a needle. And what I would do is to just, don't cut off the thread once you've finished sewing, but just to then bring that through the eye of the needle. And I'm actually going to tie these together. So I'm going to tie the needle to the thread here so it's secured for when I start turning it. So I leave a little bit of thread there, so don't tie it too close because it just gives you a bit of space to manoeuvre. Make sure that's secure. And then if you're using a blunt needle, then it doesn't matter which way you poke your needle, but if your needle is sharp, you want to poke the eye end in first. That way you're not continually sort of poking yourself back out through the fabric. So posting that in all the way through, and then what you want to do is push it in so far, and then at the end that needs to turn, just try and get that turning. So I kind of rub it a little bit, try and pull it through, and this is where the slippiness of the fabric really helps. So you want to get that started turning before you've bunched up all your fabric, and it's pretty much impossible. So then I can pull that the rest of the way through, and then I can just carry on turning my tube through to the right side. Okay, so I've now got my 2 strips. I can just cut the needle off of that and worry about trying to undo that knot later. And I'm now ready for the next stage. What you don't want to do is press these. So you want to try, and they want to leave them so that they're kind of springy and rounded. I'm now ready to attach my rouleau loops to my base fabric. So I've got my loops, and I'm going to take one piece of my fabric, and to help me mark out where the loops are going to go, I'm going to just measure a line that's 3 centimetres from the raw edge. I'm just going to chalk that line in, and this helps to keep my loops all the same size. So I'm going to aim to create a series of 3 loops on this side of the fabric, and I want to try to make sure that the strip that I'm using is an even width all the way along. So if you found you've got some areas which are thin and then fat, thin and then fat, try to just isolate areas which are the same. That will make your loops look neater. I'm going to start about 1.5 centimetres down from the top edge of my fabric, and I'm going to roll my strip so that the seam is facing downwards. So I'm just going to start by pinning that one in place. So that's 1.5 centimetres from the edge of the fabric. So you can measure down 1.5 centimetres, and then you can place your first strip in line with that. So the seam facing downwards, the edge without the seam is in line with where I've just marked with chalk. So I'm just going to pin that in place there. And then to form these loops, so the loops will be touching this chalk line here. So just bring that round, folding that back round again. And what I do with my seam edge here again is I've folded the seam edge round so the seam edge, the two seam edges come together on the inside of the loop. And then I'm just going to carry on making loops. So you can leave a gap if you want, or you can just butt them up to each other. So I find it easier if they just come towards each other like that. So again, I'm just folding my loop round so that the seam edge is facing down. I'm going to pin that in place. I just want them to touch a little bit more. And then wind that round. So again, the seam edge here is going to match with the seam edge there, and this line of chalk is where the tip of my loops will come to. So these are the loops here that I'm forming. All of this bit here that's hanging off the edge of the fabric, this is like all the waste bit that's going to go into the seam allowance. So this is the important bit here. And I'm going to make another loop. So again, just curling that round so that the seam edge is pointing down. And bringing that back round so the seam edge will meet and touch the other seam edge. And my loop touches that chalk edge there, that chalk line. Now, if you've got enough to create another loop, you can carry on and make another loop if you want to, but you just, for this sample, you need to have just at least 3. So if you've got 3 and you're happy with them, then that's absolutely fine. And then just fold that round to make my last loop, and then make sure that that loop is touching that chalk line so that they are all the same measurement. Okay, so those are my loops, 4 loops formed. And now what I'm going to do is to just machine stitch down here just to hold those in position. I've set my machine to a long stitch, and I want to just sew 1 centimetre to about 1.3 centimetres in from the edge. So on the needle plate I'm following this line, which is 1 centimetre, and I'm aiming to be between there and the 15 line, but not over here, so somewhere around here. And this line of stitch is just to hold these loops in place before they're kind of permanently stitched. So I want to make sure that the pins aren't going to move and that they're just sewn absolutely over there. So I'll just back tack a little. So they're just held in place there with that long machine stitch. Now that these are sewn in place, I can take out the pins, and then I'm going to take another piece of fabric and just place that right sides together. So I'm kind of making a sandwich with my rouleau loops. Place that right sides together, and then if I pin the other way so I can see the line that I've already sewn, just pin these together And then I'm going to machine stitch again 1.5 centimetres in from the edge. I've gone back to a regular length stitch and I'm just going to follow the 15 line on my needle plate. I'll just go back and forth and then stitch all the way along there, keeping the seam allowance correct. All the way to the bottom and then just back to the position. And now that that's complete, I can take those pins out, and then when I open this up and turn that over, you can see that I've formed then those loops there. And you can always sort of poke them through, help them to form an even shape. And if you feel that you've got too much loop showing, you could always go back, fold that over again, stitch a bit further this way, and then give yourself slightly smaller loops. So what I'm going to do next is to create another one of these, a mirror image, using my other 2 pieces of fabric so that I can create a kind of lace up back that I would have on a corset. So to create these in the opposite way, I've marked in 3 centimetres from the raw edge of the fabric here, and I'm going to be creating the loops going in this way. So using my other piece of fabric, my other rouleau strip that I've made, I've measured down 1.5 centimetres so that would match with the top of my other loop over here. I'm going to roll my strip over so that the seam edge faces down, and then create these as I did on the other side. So my next stage will be to just long machine stitch 1 centimetre in from the edge, and then once that's done, sandwich the loops in between the other layer, stitch 1.5 centimetres in, and then that will give me another section of rouleau loops. So I've now got my 2 sections created, and they will come together one side to the other side like that. And then I can lace these up. But before I do that, I'm going to just use some understitching to keep the underside to the underside. So I'm going to be sewing through this piece, which will be like the lining, sewing through here, sewing through the seam allowance on the underside. So we'll have a line of stitching that goes down here, and that will sit to the wrong side once it's completed. I want to make sure that I understitch the right sides rather than ending up with 2 left sides or 2 right sides. And before I do that, I'm also going to just cut away and pink this edge here. So I'm just going to trim this down, cutting off those bits of the loops which I don't need anymore. And then I'll do the same in here as well, cutting all of that away. And if you've got threads, you can cut off any loose threads at this point as well. And then you might find it easier if you just use the side that you've chalked on as being the wrong side. So I'm going to understitch the side that has been chalked. So this side I'm going to be understitching here. And then this side I'm going to be understitching here. And if you put a pin in and just check that once that's understitched and turned to the underside, and once this is understitched and turned to the underside, then that will form the right pair. To do the understitching, I'm going to be sewing onto the chalked side, and that's it's going to catch the seam allowance underneath. So just do a regular length stitch, a few stitches forward and then back, and then I'm going to stitch all the way along, sewing a few millimetres from this original seam line here. And as you sew, just pull that flat so that you don't end up with a ridge here. And then back tack at that end. On the second side, I'm understitching to this side of the fabric, and again it's going to catch the seam allowance here. So taking a couple of stitches forward and back, and then sewing all the way along, making sure you're pulling that flat as you go so you're not forming a ridge. Pulling all the way to the end and then back tack at that end. Now that I've done all the understitching, I'm going to go around each of the pieces and just pink the edges so that they are not going to fray. Just make sure you're not going to cut through any of your stitching there. So pinking all the way around. And then as a final step, what I will do is just press the sample so that the loops sit to the correct side and that the one layer will sit to the underside. So I'm going to fold my sample in half so that the understitch side sits to the underside, and then just press these. So I've put the iron on a cool heat. What I don't want to do is to melt my loops because they're made out of a slightly different fabric, which is probably won't tolerate the heat of the iron as much as this cotton fabric will. And you might actually want to do your pinking of the edges once you've done the ironing part, because you can see mine is slightly misaligned there now. So once that's all done, you can just choose yourself some ribbon and then you can lace up your loops. And that's complete.